She came walking down the frost-glazed lane like a shadow the dawn hadn't quite managed to forget. Her coat was too thin, her boots mismatched, and her eyes, that ghostly gray like the sky before a storm, carried the weight of someone who had watched everything she loved burn. The townsfolk saw her first from behind windows, behind curtains pulled back just enough to whisper, "Willa Harper." Someone muttered it near the mercantile. Another said it near the post. By the time she passed the church, the name was already bitter on the wind, like smoke curling off old ash. Inside the gunsmith shop, Silas Crowley rubbed oil into walnut grips and pretended not to hear. He'd known the name before. He remembered her as a girl with honey blonde braids and hymn book fingers. That was before the chapel fire, before the killing, before her own father cast her out like a plague. Now she walked with her head high, though her shoulders told the truth, hunched, quiet, braced for stones that hadn't yet been thrown. Silas kept working. Willa didn't stop walking until she reached the far edge of town, where the soil turned to dry scrub and the houses thinned like old breath. She stopped just outside the gunsmith shop and sat on the stoop without a word. Not begging, not crying, just still, like someone waiting to thaw. The stove inside ticked softly. Silas didn't speak for a long time. He just watched her through the wavering glass of the shop window, watched her cradle her satchel like it held something worth more than gold. Maybe it did. Maybe it held the last thread of her name. When he finally opened the door, the cold swept in like a curse. "You can sit inside," he said simply. Willa didn't move. He tried again. "I don't ask questions. Not unless you're buying a rifle." That earned him the ghost of a smile, but it was tight-lipped and sadder than silence. She stepped inside. The shop smelled of gun oil, wood dust and old war. Rifles lined the back wall in dark rows, and tools hung on hooks above the workbench like instruments in a surgeon's kit. She stood there with her hands still wrapped around her satchel, unsure where to set herself down. "Chair by the stove's warm," he said. "If you're of a mind to sit." She sat, quietly, like a bird that had once been caged. Silas said nothing more. He returned to his bench, hammering a pin into place with careful, rhythmic taps. He didn't look at her, not directly, but he watched her reflection in the glass of the cabinet door, how she folded her hands, how she watched the fire like it might tell her if she still had a place in the world. Outside, the snow had started again, light as dust falling from heaven. The wind picked up, hissing against the corners of the building like a warning. Willa pulled her coat tighter. "Miss Dovey's got a barn room out back," Silas murmured after a while. "Used to house mules, but she boards folks in it come hard weather." She nodded. "She'll feed you, too, if you don't mind her talk." Willa gave a low laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Talk's better than stones." He nodded once, then went back to his work. They didn't speak again that night. The next morning, before the sun lifted its full head over the ridges, Willa swept the shop porch. Silas hadn't asked her to. She did it the way some people pray, quiet, steady, with no one to see but the sky. When he opened the door, she was already gone. She did it again the next day, and the next. On the fourth morning, he handed her a biscuit with bacon tucked inside. She didn't thank him, just took it gently, as though the gesture might disappear if acknowledged. After a week, the talk had thickened. Dovey Lark, with her sharp mouth and wide hips, visited the shop under the guise of needing a gun sight cleaned. "She's trouble," she said softly, glancing toward the barn through the shop's back window. "You know what they say she done?" "I know what they said," Silas replied. Dovey sighed, folding her hands atop the counter like she was arranging a funeral bouquet. "She's pretty under all that dirt. That's half the reason the men folk worry." Silas didn't answer. That night, Willa stayed a little longer in the shop. She traced her fingers along the wood grain of her rifle stock, eyes thoughtful. "You ever teach anyone?" she asked, voice low. Silas looked up from his work. "Shoot." She nodded. "Couple boys, long time ago." She turned toward him, expression unreadable. "You think a woman can learn it? If she's got hands." Willa looked down at her own, scarred and strong. "You aiming to kill someone?" he asked plainly. "No," she said. "I just want to stop being afraid." Silas considered that, then gestured toward a practice revolver on the shelf. "Tomorrow, before breakfast. Bring gloves." She did. The next morning was gray and bitter. They walked to the edge of town, where the trees thinned out and the land dipped into a shallow rise of dry field. He set up bottles on a split-rail fence and handed her the revolver. "Hold it like this," he said, guiding her grip with calloused hands. She didn't flinch, didn't tremble, just watched him, silent, absorbing everything. "Breathe in," he said. "Exhale, steady, like you're whispering a secret." The first shot missed. So did the second. But the third kissed the bottle's neck and sent it tumbling. She didn't smile. Her eyes only grew steadier. Day by day, he showed her more: how to clean the chamber, how to handle recoil, how to trust the line between sight and breath. She never said much. But sometimes at dusk she'd bring in firewood before he even asked. Sometimes she left wildflowers in a cracked jar by the shop window. And once she mended the rip in his old duster coat with stitches so small they seemed like thread woven by time itself. Silas didn't speak of his past, but Willa noticed how he rubbed his shoulder in the cold, noticed the faded metals gathering dust in a drawer left ajar. She never asked, but her silence said she knew. One evening, as a low storm rolled across the horizon, she lingered longer than usual. The fire in the stove cast golden light over her face. Her hair had begun to curl again at the ends, no longer weighed down by grease and grief. "You ever shoot someone?" she asked. Silas nodded once. "Or don't give you time to think." She looked down, fingers clasped around a mug of tea. "I didn't mean to light that fire," she whispered. "I was trying to find warmth." Candles fell. "He the man." She stopped. "You don't have to tell me," Silas said gently. "I want to." So she did, in halting words, like stones pulled one by one from a cold river. The man who wouldn't take no. Her father who wouldn't hear yes. The church that would rather burn than believe her. When she was finished, there were tears in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Silas, too, was silent, not because he didn't know what to say, but because there was nothing in the world he could offer her better than what he already had. Presence, steadiness, no judgment. That was the night he left the shop door unlocked. Spring hadn't come, but the wind was softer now. On the 15th morning, Willa brought stew she'd made from rabbit and potatoes. It was too salty, and the bread was burnt. Silas ate it anyway. "You could have just said it was bad," she muttered. "I've had worse in the trenches." A pause. "You gonna keep teaching me?" she asked. "If you keep sweeping." She smiled then. A real one, small and tired and true. Outside, the townsfolk still whispered. Dovey still warned. The sheriff still eyed the shop with suspicion when he passed. But inside, something had taken root, something like trust, something like thaw. They were not lovers. Not yet. Not even friends, by the measure most would use. But they were two souls who'd found, in the ashes of who they'd been, a fire warm enough to keep going. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the woman who once ran from flame, a quiet promise began to form. If ever the day came, she'd stand and return the kindness, even if it meant drawing fire herself. The mornings came colder now, not the kind of cold that howled or threatened frostbite, but the quiet kind that clung low to the ground and made breath hang like secrets between strangers. Willa rose early, before the sun warmed the rooftops, and swept the gunsmith's porch with slow, careful strokes. Each motion was deliberate, as though she believed if she could just make this one small space clean, the rest of her life might follow. Inside, Silas brewed chicory coffee and set out 2 tin mugs without comment. They didn't speak much in the mornings. Words for them had become like bullets, spent only when necessary, each one carrying weight. Willa's coat was no longer ragged. Dovey had sewn her a new one, unasked and muttering about town appearances. But the kindness had an edge to it, like most things in a place where gossip moved quicker than forgiveness. Willa had grown steadier with the gun. Each day, her aim improved, her hands more confident. Not bold, never bold, but sure. Silas taught her the rhythm of firing and reloading, of checking sights and trusting instincts. Her body remembered before her mind did. Somewhere, buried beneath years of church girl obedience, lived a woman born to survive. Silas noticed a change before she did. Her shoulders didn't curl so inward anymore. Her voice, when it came, held a clarity like water poured into a clean glass. There was still fear in her, but it no longer sat in the front of her eyes. It waited deeper now, quiet and watchful, like a creature deciding if it could sleep. "You're learning fast," he said one morning after a clean grouping of shots. "I have to," she replied. "There's nowhere left to run." He didn't press her. Silas never asked what she'd do if it came to a fight, only made sure she knew how to survive one. She practiced every day, even when her hands were raw from chopping wood or her back ached from helping Dovey in the kitchen. She trained not to kill, but to be ready. The town didn't like it. One afternoon, as she cleaned the revolver on the porch, Sheriff Hart Copley rode up slow, his horse's hooves crunching gravel like bones. He tipped his hat to Silas and nodded toward Willa. "That true?" he asked. "You got her handling your irons?" Silas didn't look up from the stock he was carving. "She's got steady hands." "That what you call it?" Hart gave a lazy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's wanted, you know, back in Rivermouth. I've seen the posters. Reckon the marshal will come through next supply run." Willa's hand froze over the cleaning cloth. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. "She's done nothing here," Silas said evenly. "Sometimes done ain't the problem," Hart said. "Sometimes it's just who folk think you are." He left without another word, dust kicking up behind him like smoke trailing from a long snuff fire. That night, Willa didn't sleep. She sat by the stove long after the flames had burned down, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into nothing. "You should leave," she said when Silas came in from the back room. "I'm not the one in danger. You are. Because of me." Her voice cracked. "They'll come for you just to get to me. You don't owe me anything." Silas knelt beside the stove and added a piece of hickory. The glow returned in low orange light, catching the silver in his beard. "Maybe not," he said, "but I've lived a long time with ghosts. You're the first soul to walk in here who didn't add to them." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. The next day, she trained harder than ever. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the chill. Her arms trembled with the effort of holding steady after each shot. Silas watched her carefully, noting the tension in her movements, the way her breath caught like she was holding back tears she hadn't earned permission to shed. After the last bottle shattered, she lowered the revolver and turned to him. "Teach me the shotgun," she said. He handed her the shorter barrel. "It kicks like guilt. I've carried worse." That night, Dovey knocked at the shop door with a plate of ham and cornbread. She pushed inside without invitation, eyes darting to where Willa sat at the back, patching a rifle sling. "You teaching her to shoot?" she asked Silas, voice like a match head about to strike. "I am." Dovey's mouth tightened. "Town's uneasy. She's walking around like she belongs here." Silas didn't rise. "Maybe she does. She don't. And folks don't forget easy. Especially men like Hart." Willa said nothing. She didn't defend herself. She simply folded the sling, set it aside, and stood. "I'll sleep in the hills tonight." Silas stood, too. "No, you won't." The stillness between them was taut, like a wire pulled tight enough to hum. "I ain't here to fight you," Dovey muttered. "I just came to warn. Folks will come knocking. And when they do, don't let her be the one who answers." She left the food and her words on the table. Willa looked at Silas. "You should have let me go weeks ago. You didn't ask to stay." She looked away, but her voice came quiet, like a truth she hadn't meant to say aloud. "I wanted someone to tell me I could." A long silence passed before Silas moved. He took the plate, divided the food between two metal plates, and handed her one. They ate together with only the fire speaking between them. The next morning, a boy brought news. Sammy Briggs, small and wild-eyed, burst into the shop out of breath. "There's a paper in the post office, with her name on it." Willa stiffened. Silas stood slowly, setting down the polishing cloth. "How many saw it?" he asked. "Half the town, I guess. Miss Dovey says it's only a matter of time now." Willa wiped her hands on her skirt. "I can leave tonight." "No." "Silas." No, his voice was iron. They put your name on a wall. That don't mean they know your story. I don't want you getting hurt. I already have been. He paused. What matters now is whether I let fear change that. She looked at him, then really looked, into the eyes of a man who'd spent his whole life haunted by what couldn't be undone, who now stood in front of her and made a choice. The sound of boots echoed outside. Marshals coming by day's end, Sammy whispered. Sheriff said so. Willa didn't tremble. She didn't weep. She walked out onto the porch and stared at the snow falling lightly onto the empty lane. The rifle rested behind the door, the one she'd learned to clean better than most men could fire. I won't shoot unless I have to, she said. I know, Silas replied. But he checked the lock on the door anyway. The sun fell slow that day, golden through the windows, soft against the dust. Silas worked the forge with steady hands. Willa swept the floor like she always did. Nothing grand happened. No thunder. No cries. Just two people bracing themselves. And far down the road, the first black shape of a horse appeared through the snow. Snow melted in the gutters, leaving behind dark ribbons of mud and soot. The air held that strange quiet after thaw, where everything seems to be waiting. Birds in bare trees, wind brushing doorframes, breath caught between seasons. But the whispers hadn't melted. They hung thick in the town, sharper than ever, shaped now by names and accusations instead of frost. The poster in the post office window had her full name. Willa Harper. Wanted for arson. Suspicion of manslaughter. Rivermouth County. Printed bold. Nailed beneath notices for a quilting bee and a missing mule. Her name stretched across the town's throat like a noose. Silas didn't take it down. He just stood in front of it for a long time, arms folded, jaw working like he might bite through iron. Behind him, boots shuffled. The townsfolk didn't speak to him. Not directly. But they lingered longer outside his shop, and Dovey no longer left Stu without a warning wrapped inside. She was never right even as a girl, she said that evening, arms crossed at his doorway. Kept too many thoughts to herself. Wore Sunday dresses on Tuesday like she didn't care who saw. That kind of woman always finds trouble. Silas said nothing. He only turned back to his workbench and picked up a worn stock that needed sanding. Willa had stayed inside most of the day. The barn was cold, but it kept the stairs away. Sammy had brought her a roll from the bakery and a string of red yarn he'd knotted like a bracelet. You could run, he whispered, eyes wide and afraid. If you left now, you could beat the marshal. I'd never outrun it, she replied, tying the red string around her wrist. Later, she stood beside Silas as he cleaned a rusted Winchester. She watched the methodical way his hands moved, as if he could fix the world one screw at a time. They'll come, she said quietly. He didn't look up. Let them. You'd lose everything. Silas set the rifle down. His gaze was steady. A man who has nothing left to lose can be dangerous. But a man who's found something worth protecting, well, that's when he becomes steady. She blinked. A breath caught in her throat. But she said nothing. By dusk, a small crowd had gathered by the general store. They spoke in hushed tones that traveled far. Willa's name passed between them like an ember, never quite lighting, but always threatening too. Children were called indoors. Lamps burned longer than needed. When Sheriff Hart arrived, he had the practiced calm of a man about to make a show of something. I want a word, he told Silas, standing at the edge of the porch with two deputies behind him. Then use fewer of 'em, Silas replied, not rising from his stool. You're harboring a fugitive. That's obstruction. She hasn't fled. Doesn't change the law. Silas let the silence drag until even the wind seemed to wait. She's under my roof, under my watch. She's no threat. Hart laughed. That ain't up to you. The Reverend's back, says the girl confessed. Willa stepped forward. Her face held no fear, only weariness. I never confessed. He told the town what he wanted them to hear. Hart gave her a slow, pitying look. Folks around here don't forget fire. Especially not fire set in a house of God. Maybe they should remember what happened in that house before it burned, she said, voice like a stone rolling slow down a hill. The sheriff's smirk faded. I've got the right to take you in, "You don't have a warrant," Silas replied, rising now, voice low and even. "And you don't have a marshal with you. Marshal be here by Friday. Then come back Friday." Hart's hand drifted toward his belt. Silas didn't move, but the air around him felt heavier, charged. Willa's hand twitched near the revolver at her hip, the one she hadn't drawn since the day she learned to fire it. After a moment, Hart spat into the dirt and turned. "This ain't over." Willa exhaled. It sounded like grief. Inside, the shop felt warmer than it had any right to. She sat by the stove, staring into the flickering blue core of the flame. Silas returned to his bench, but didn't pick up a tool. She spoke first. "I didn't kill him." He nodded, but waited. "He followed me that night. Lit a match to see my face. Said I owed him silence. But I knocked the candle, not meaning to. It rolled under the pews. The whole place went up before I could scream." Her hands curled into fists. "I stayed. Tried to put it out. But the doors, he'd locked them from the inside. He wanted it all to go up with me, inside." Silas didn't interrupt. "My father saw the flames and said it was proof. That I was cursed. The congregation didn't even look at me. They just turned their backs." She blinked hard. Her voice had no quiver. She had told this story to herself too many times for tears now. "I didn't confess. I ran." Silas reached for the oil can, then stopped. Truth burns slower than lies, but it lasts longer. She gave a bitter half-smile. "You really think that matters?" He leaned back, eyes steady on hers. "I think it matters to you. And that's enough." The next morning, Reverend Ashby rode into town wearing black, his hat pulled low over his brow. People gathered around him like sheep hoping fire could be prayed away. He walked with the air of a man untouched by doubt, scripture always on his tongue. At midday, he stood in the town square and read from a parchment in a voice too smooth for a father who'd lost a child. "My daughter stands accused, and she shall answer. Let her come forward and meet the law with a clean soul." Willa stood in the doorway of the shop, her face unreadable. "They'd believe him if he told them the moon was made of ashes," she said. "That's because they're afraid of the dark," Silas replied. "Should I speak?" He looked at her. "Only if you want them to hear." She didn't answer, but stepped back inside. Later that afternoon, Sammy arrived again, muddy from the waist down, a tear on one sleeve. "Some boys tried to push me in the creek," he mumbled. "Said I was a traitor for helping you." Willa crouched, taking his chin in her hand. "Are you hurt?" "No, ma'am." He looked at her, with eyes too old for his small face. "But they said you'd burn our town next." She closed her eyes for a moment, then looked to Silas. "I never asked to be saved." He shook his head. "Didn't save you. Just stood still long enough for you to stop running." They didn't talk again that night. But Willa sat beside the stove as Silas mended an old rifle, the kind no one used anymore, but that he kept in shape just the same. The fire crackled, steady and low. Outside, the Reverend met with Sheriff Hart in hushed voices. And inside, Willa cleaned her revolver with hands that didn't shake. The morning rose amber and windless, the kind of morning that gave no warning. No thunder, no omen, just the sun rising soft as always, indifferent to the weight in men's hearts. Willa stood in the threshold of the gunsmith shop, her hair braided and tucked under a hat that had once belonged to Silas. The revolver rode her hip like it had always been there, part of her shape now. Across the square, the church bell rang though no sermon had been called. Its sound was hollow, not a call to worship, just a signal. The meeting had begun. Silas locked the front door. His hands were steady. They had been steady through war, through grief, through years of hammering truth into iron and steel. But today, something deeper moved beneath his ribs, something he hadn't felt in years. Fear not for himself, but for someone else. "They'll try to shame you," he said quietly as they walked side by side. "Try to twist your story to fit their comfort." Willa's eyes stayed ahead. "I won't give them comfort." The town square had filled slow, like water creeping into a dry place. Faces were hard to read, some curious, some cold, a few quietly sympathetic, but not enough to count. Dovey stood near the bakery, arms crossed, eyes flicking between Willa and the raised steps of the old courthouse. Children clung to mothers' skirts. Men leaned on fence posts as if the outcome were a coin toss, and they were simply watching it spin. Reverend Ashby stood tall at the top of the steps, Bible in hand, face carved from years of certainty. He wore the same black coat from the chapel fire, its cuffs worn thin, as if to remind them all that sin had a cost, and he'd borne it more nobly than most. Sheriff Hart stood to his right, silver badge catching the morning light. "I see her," Ashby said, voice rising above the murmurs. "And she stands among us not with remorse, but pride. Not with sorrow, but with defiance." Willa didn't flinch. She stopped at the base of the steps and lifted her chin. "I came because I'm done hiding," she said. "You want to speak truth, Reverend? Let's both bleed it today." A hush. Even the wind paused. "You burned a holy place," Ashby thundered. "You ended a life." "I survived yours," she said. He blinked. "I lit no fire on purpose. I begged you to believe me. But you locked the doors and left me to be swallowed whole." Murmurs now louder. A few gasps. Dovey's hand flew to her mouth. "She's lying," Ashby snapped. "She's always lied. She came into this world deceiving." "She came into this world your daughter," Silas said, stepping forward. "But she'll leave it her own woman." The sheriff moved then, stepping forward with his hand on his pistol. "This isn't a trial," Hart said, gaze fixed on Willa. "You're wanted. Poster says enough. You can come quiet or come wrong, but you're coming." Willa didn't move. "I've done nothing worth running from." "You think law waits for innocence?" Hart sneered. "That ain't how the West works." And then he drew. The shot was meant for Silas. But it never landed. The crack of Willa's revolver rang out so clean, so sharp, it split the air like lightning through a black sky. Hart's gun flew from his hand, struck by her bullet before it cleared his belt. The crowd gasped as it landed in the dust. No one moved. Willa stepped forward, revolver steady, not pointed at anyone, but heavy with the memory of what it could do. "I have been hunted. I have been shamed. I have been called liar, whore, devil, and curse. But I am none of those things," she said, voice carrying like thunder without the storm. "I'm just a woman who survived what none of you dared to name." Her words landed heavier than the shot. Reverend Ashby opened his mouth, but no sound came. Silas stepped beside her, shoulders squared. "The girl you condemned is gone. But the woman standing here, she'll answer to no man who calls shame holy." Hart clutched his hand, stunned by the near miss. "Arrest her," Ashby barked. "She's armed." "No," came a voice from a crowd. It was Dovey. She stepped forward slowly, her face tight with something between anger and regret. "I heard the boy," she said. "Sammy. Heard him say she tried to stop the fire, that she screamed for help." Ashby turned on her. "You'd take a child's word." "I'd take it over yours, if that child don't have reason to lie." Another voice rose, Mr. Ellard, who'd once sold apples by the chapel. "I remember her singing hymns better than you preach them." Then a third, then a fourth. The wind picked up, carrying the shifting breath of a town beginning to listen. Ashby's face contorted. "You've all been deceived. She's poisoned your minds." Willa lowered her revolver slowly, holstering it without fanfare. "No one poisoned them," she said. "You just ran out of places to bury me." Hart backed away, still nursing his bruised pride. "You're lucky that shot wasn't meant to kill." Silas looked at him flatly. "So is she." "Because she didn't miss." The Reverend stepped down the stairs, face red with fury, but no one cleared the way for him. He had to push through the crowd now, no longer elevated. Just another man in black, trying to escape the sound of truth. The sheriff didn't follow. Instead, he gave Willa one last look, part challenge, part awe, then turned and walked the other direction. Silas and Willa stood alone for a moment in the square. The crowd parted around them like a sea that had suddenly forgotten how to crash. A child clapped. Then silence. Then another clap. Until applause, uncertain but real, carried through the square, not celebration, but recognition. For courage. For endurance. For a woman who could no longer be silenced. Later that day, the poster came down. No one admitted to pulling the nail, but it vanished all the same. In the weeks that followed, The shop door stayed open longer. Willa took over more tasks, measuring stocks, fitting grips, even speaking softly to the occasional customer who didn't quite meet her eye, but handed her coin anyway. She wore the red yarn bracelet still. Sammy added a bead to it, carved from oak. "Means strength," he said shyly. Willa smiled, and for the first time, it stayed on her face even when no one was looking. Silas didn't ask her to stay. He didn't have to. She built a cot in the back room, reorganized the tools, laughed once when she caught him burning the cornbread she used to get wrong. The town changed slowly, like a scar healing from the inside out. People didn't apologize, not directly, but they nodded now, brought her pie, spoke her name without bitterness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the dust roads gold, Willa stood on the porch with a rifle in her arms, her shadow stretching long. "You ever think we're still in the fire?" she asked. Silas leaned beside her, pipe in hand. "Sometimes," he said. "But the thing about fire, it doesn't just burn. It also refines." They stood a long while, without words. And then Willa whispered, half to herself, "Funny, isn't it? You taught me to shoot, thinking it might save me." Silas's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Didn't know you'd be the one to save me instead." And in that silence, soft and full as spring rain, something in both of them settled. Not peace, not yet, but promise. Sometimes in the quiet corners of the world, a gun speaks not in vengeance, but in mercy. Sometimes it draws a line that says no more, not a blood, but a fear. And sometimes the person who pulls the trigger isn't seeking justice or glory or revenge, just the right to stay standing. And maybe that's what salvation really is. Not a prayer whispered in shame, but a bullet that says, "I'm still here, still worth something, still whole."